something that pops up a lot in the literature on high doses is having some sort of contact with what seems to be an entity that is potentially freestanding and autonomous in its own right in a different dimension or something like that.
Jon Dean, it is a real pleasure to have you on the show. I've been interested in the subject we're going to be talking about for a long time. Welcome, man. It's great to meet you.
Yeah, same.
I would love to start with a basic question to you. I know you're a scientist, a former musician, maybe a current musician as well still. How in the hell did you get interested in the subject of what we're going to talk about today, which is DMT?
Uh yeah, so I mean it's pretty straightforward. Um I mean, so I have always been really keen on science in grade school and high school and whatnot. I didn't really, when I started college, think that I would. It never occurred to me, hey, go be a major in chemistry, or which I was. Um, yes, I mean I tell the story pretty much the same way every time, but it really kind of boiled down to a little bit of an existential
Mm.
crisis early on in life. I had a close friend that died out of nowhere, young, we were like 19. And yeah, for whatever reason, that just kind of hit me. It hit me pretty hard. And it was also like right around the time, where you're experimenting with consciousness and so all that kind of it all factored into one another. And I just became fascinated by the idea that the brain is complicated to the point where you can take a compound that'll completely change consciousness and change reality, um, and that there has to be some sort of neurological, at least, correlate of that. And there wasn't a whole lot of research on that, and so that kind of sent me down the path of changing a major to chemistry. Well, I didn't really have a major at that point, so I started taking like psychology courses, and I was playing music, playing in bands along that time as well. And so then I kind of got through all the psychology courses that were interesting to me, which most of them had like abnormal or like biological correlate to them, or like underpinning to the curriculum. And then uh, started taking chemistry and really enjoyed that a lot. Always liked organic chemistry. And then through my reading and through my studying, came to find that DMT is present in bodily fluids and in humans and in other mammals, and that it's literally like the same molecule, that when you take it exogenously, you have these very powerful, bizarre experiences. And no one was really, at least contemporarily, investigating why DMT is present in the body from a scientific perspective. And I mean, it fascinated me, one, and then two, it just seemed like, you could do these types of studies, right? If you're able to quantify DMT, which it was clear that you could, even if it was kind of crude and the studies never really hammered it down, so to speak. But it was a starting point, so that kind of got me into what I did for my master's and PhD, which was look at rodent models for quantifying endogenously generated DMT within the living rat brain
Mm.
specifically. And we use that approach because we would be able to compare it to known neurotransmitters using these like bread and butter analytical chemistry techniques. So able to sample the fluid right out of the living brain of a rat, which circumvented sort of all of the literature that said, "Oh, well, DMT gets broken down really quick," and which it does, it seems, in the blood in the periphery. And nothing was really known about the brain because there weren't really any studies like directly looking at a living brain, because in the 50s and 60s you couldn't really do that. There's like a lot of post-mortem stuff and radio labeling precursors and tossing it into tissues and things of this nature. And then, so, in the 90s and 2000s, molecular biology sort of caught up. You could clone the enzymes that have been shown to be able to biosynthesize it. So we kind of took a multimodal approach to understanding the distribution of those enzymes in the rat brain and sampling living brain fluid.
Hmm.
So that's kind of the what brought me to my PhD at least, and then now I'm doing human clinical trials, like we talked about a little bit,
Yeah.
on psilocybin for chronic phantom limb pain, and then soon to be doing continuously infused DMT studies as well. So those will be launching within a couple of months if we're really lucky with the regulatory stuff. But we're getting closer to getting that off of the ground here too at UCSD.
I want to clarify a couple things for the audience. When you say
Yeah, that was winded. Sorry.
No, that was great. I think for just to define terms, when you say endogenous DMT, you mean it's naturally created in the human animal and in other mammals as well. If I understand that correctly, that it's found throughout the human body. This is a lot of what I think your 2019 study indicated. And I also wanted to dig into the story you started with, which was your friend dying at 19. How do you think that influenced the trajectory of your life from then to now?
Yeah. So yeah, the first part's correct, right? So endogenous DMT, it means it's just it's naturally occurring. So it's not like you smoke it. It's what you can measure without doing the drug. Like it's already being produced, it seems like, in the body by some sort of known mechanism, but not really known that well.
Yeah.
So yeah, that, and then I mean, it's just kind of, well, I mean, it made me question reality, honestly. It made me say, well, we don't really have a clue what's going on with reality, with the brain, with life, with death. No one really knows what that is, and there's so much research on in science. There's so much research on keeping people alive, which is fantastic research. It's very, very valuable to be alive, and very grateful for that. But yeah, I mean, I was just like, wow, no one really knows too much about what happens when you die, at least from a scientific perspective, obviously, because when you die, like, materialism sort of goes out the window for what we know, right? So it's kind of hard to measure that, but you can measure the process and things that are related to it. It's hard to fund those types of studies, so there isn't a ton out there on that.
There's a great Carl Jung line, which I love about this, which I heard a couple of years ago, which is life is a short pause between two great mysteries, which I think is maybe related to some degree to your, curiosity, especially in the face of someone close to you dying. I want to go into a little bit of the chronology of, knowledge about DMT. And in preparation for this interview, I was, rereading Rick Strassman's book, DMT, The Spirit Molecule, and just getting more familiar with some of the specifics of what happened when that people began to learn about DMT as a molecule. And just to set the table with some of the history, I'll give a couple of points, and you're welcome to correct me if any of this is wrong. But my understanding is that the Canadian chemist Richard Mansky synthesized DMT for the first time in 1931. In June 1965, a German research discovered and quantified DMT in human blood and urine. I think you were referencing that a little bit earlier about DMT being known to be a part of human bodily fluids. Strassman, it seems like, really, and I think I've heard you use this phrase about his work, ripped the door off of psychedelic research, or reopened the door for psychedelic research with his DMT research at the University of New Mexico in the 90s. Maybe I can just give this to you. And I'm assuming in your journey to where you are now, that man and potentially that book had an influence on you. What do you remember resonating about Strassman and his work that, interested you in general?
Yeah, so that book is definitely was huge in my trajectory. Rick's book, DMT, The Spirit Molecule. So right around that time, like when I was I mean, that's how I found out about DMT. I read that book. I don't remember how I found the book, to be honest. I might have just been like serendipity at a bookstore. I can't even remember, but or maybe I saw it on like Earwood or something. Because this is close to when it came out. It had been the early 2000s when I read it. But anyhow, yeah, that book, it was just like communicated very well. The concepts, Rick writes very succinct and communicates like very complicated concepts well, in my opinion, scientifically, but then also isn't afraid to speculate a little bit and be very clear that, hey, I'm speculating here, but this is an interesting avenue that a scientist could venture down if they are ready for the long haul.
Yeah.
So his book was definitely big in my trajectory.
And to be clear, Rick Strassman is a doctor, a psychiatrist, and a professor, as I understand it. I mean, a pretty well-credentialed man. I want to read a couple of quotes from him. And you talked about speculation. The book details his experience of injecting DMT. This is all above board. This was all authorized to, I think, 50 or so subjects 400 times. So 400 doses into roughly 5 dozen volunteers, and recording basic biological responses like their heart rate, their blood pressure, but also anecdotal feedback from these people who are reporting what it's like to get a certain quantity of DMT injected into their veins. And maybe before I read some of Rick's speculation, I'd be curious to know if the stories from the people in the book still resonate with you as being noteworthy or just extremely interesting. I will just say personally, what got me interested in DMT is having friends having had this experience of smoking DMT and listening to what they said they experienced. It is just damn peculiar. I don't know how you could listen to some of these stories from otherwise extraordinarily intelligent and sober-minded, rational people and come away from hearing some of these stories not scratching your head a little bit. Maybe I'll just give that to you and ask if there's any stories from the book or even in your personal life of either your own experiences or friends doing DMT and sparking an incredible amount of wonder and curiosity.
Yeah. I mean, I think you summarized it pretty spot on. That was what attracted me to the study of it, in particular because it's found naturally. And, it doesn't necessarily mean that because it's found naturally that it's involved in near-death experiences and dreaming and like some of the more out there theories of what it's doing in the body and in the brain. Because we haven't really established that scientifically, just because it's so hard to really quantify that the molecule itself in the body, particularly in humans, which is something that we're working toward. Assays that would be more reliable in humans. And so that's kind of would be the gold standard to establish any physiological role for DMT, let alone some of the more speculative and admittedly a little bit sexier hypotheses for it. But since the overlap is there, since there are dreamlike qualities to a DMT trip, or there are overlaps with some near-death experience reports with DMT, and since it's found naturally, I mean, it's not exactly non-scientific to make that connection. Like that's how science works, in my opinion. That's how it works for me, anyways. I think that the psychology and the experiential component of any type of neuroscience is particularly important to understanding how a certain area of the brain works, because otherwise it's just a lump of flesh, right? So depending on if you're talking about psychology, right, and experiential content, but yes, it's not really known what endogenous DMT is doing, but those reports certainly are enticing to think that that something that's so similar to serotonin, which is a major neurotransmitter, and this is also one of the findings in our 2019 paper, was that when we measured and compared DMT in the rat brain, in the living rat brain with these microdialysis probes, they're called, we were kind of surprised too, to see that it was in concentrations comparable to serotonin, about half of serotonin.
Mm.
There's more to it than that, obviously. There's you got to zoom in a little bit to look at the pharmacology, and those were some of the discussions that stemmed from the paper. Were, well, is this actually a concentration that would necessitate any physiological function? I'm not a pharmacologist, but I would say that if it's there half of serotonin, it's likely doing something in the brain, whether that's related to like processing any sort of like information or consciousness, who knows? It could be an anti-inflammatory role. There's been studies that have shown that it's helpful for stroke, at least in rodent models, and then people are carrying out clinical trials right now, early phases of administering DMT to people that have had a stroke, to try to expedite recovery. So it's really not known what's going on there. But to go back to the original question, I mean, it's very peculiar that you can increase the amount of DMT in the brain to a large level and have such strange effects, more so than if you increase the amount of serotonin, with something like MDMA or something like that.
What do people, and again, I know you're a scientist, and part of that ethos is not overstating what you have high confidence in believing and can show evidence for, but just anecdotally from the stories that you've heard in books and in your own life, perhaps, what do people report that, when this, from, I think it was Terence McKenna, I was listening to an interviewer, Dennis McKenna, who mentioned that part of what appeals to him about DMT is its simplicity as a molecule, and that you just noted it's how common and the level at which it seems to be endogenous in the brain. People who get a spike of DMT inserted into their bodies, what kind of stories do they tend to report in your experience when they seem to go somewhere else?
Yeah, I mean, they're pretty variable stories, right? I mean, they're out there. So we haven't started to do our studies yet. But I mean, the reports are fairly, there's a lot of commonalities. And something that pops up a lot in the literature on high doses is having some sort of contact with what seems to be an entity that is potentially freestanding and autonomous in its own right in a different dimension or something like that. And that's pretty common. It pops up a lot. There's some debate whether that's potentially a cultural thing. And that's a very interesting question in and of itself. I remember I did a talk not too long ago in Arizona, I think it was, in Phoenix, and somebody asked a really good question that I think I gave some smart ass answer, because I was like, man, I don't have an answer to that. But it was regarding like with people that speak different languages, has it ever been kind of like investigated what the sort of link, like what language was being communicated by, because two-way communication with entities is very common in the DMT experience. So something like that, I think, would be an interesting question that would kind of hint at like the cultural significance of it. But I mean, yeah, bizarre stories, but I think a pretty common thread seems to be entity phenomena. And yeah, so I mean, I'm just kind of dipping my feet in that world now and starting to understand more of the the literature on the experiential components, because I was living in the molecular biology world for so long with the endogenous stuff, and now that we're ramping up to be administering DMT in humans, yeah, we wanna understand everything related to safety and proper dosing, and then also the experiential component is going to be huge in the investigation. So we're very interested in the types of experiences that people have, particularly in the domain of like entity contact and things of this nature. And then just really basic science questions like how does, I mean, we have the potential to really change the visual system, right, with DMT, and at a basic level understanding like what happens in the brain to juxtapose that with just like normal visual processing is something that we're interested in doing. And then of course, you know, a lot of the studies we do at UCSD are geared toward alleviating chronic pain. We have a very large pain research community here, so we're particularly interested in things like I was saying earlier, like DMT for stroke and other pain conditions that don't have a lot of options. So yeah, so it's a pretty big study, and out of the gate it'll be in healthy individuals, but yeah, we hope that it can help some people for sure. That's the main goal, and then to do the cute neuroscience in tandem.
Yeah. I didn't know this before preparing for this conversation, that apparently there is some evidence, or a significant amount of evidence, that conscious quantities of DMT also seem to have potentially some antidepressant characteristics or effects on people, similar to what many people report on psilocybin, which I wasn't aware of. And I want to get into your research at Michigan and some other subjects as well. But just to pause for a second and think about a person who has never heard about this subject or knows very little about DMT or the psychedelic world in general. I have to imagine for someone who is leading these studies, it's probably a delicate dance to speak cautiously so that you can back up what you are claiming with evidence while not sounding crazy. Because so much of what I came across in the last few days in preparation for this, if I were to, I think, tell an average American or average person what these people claim to be experiencing and what some of the more speculative theories are about DMT in particular, that these people are crazy could be a common reaction that a lot of people would have. How have you dealt with that for yourself? I mean, obviously, Rick, just in reading his book, he clearly was extremely interested in learning about the anecdotes of what people were experiencing under the influence of DMT, but he had to get funding and do this legally. So I'd love to put that to you to speak to a general, public or a general population audience about how you think about that.
Yeah. Okay. That's a lot. Well, I watched the Super Bowl and I feel crazy. So it's a very relative thing, right?
Fair enough.
But yeah, but I mean, so we just want to do it right. We want to do it, and by right, I mean most importantly, safe. So that's what keeps me up at night, and has for the past several nights.
I'm sure.
Is just making sure that we're doing this safely across the map. We understand the responsibility of keeping the people that are participating in all of our studies with psychedelics, making sure that they're coming out of the study benefiting in some way, shape, or form. And so that includes, having a team of monitors, like therapists on hand, that work with our participants from the beginning all the way through the end of the study, whether it's for the clinical outcomes or, in the case of the DMT work, initially just in not for a clinical indication, just otherwise it's healthy individuals that are participating. So that's number one. And then, number two, I mean, we're geeks. We want to know how the brain works also. And yeah, I mean, the neuroscience in general, like no matter what question I feel like in neuroscience you're asking, I mean, yeah, we ask these like crazy questions about consciousness, but even if you dive down the periscope of any like kind of isolated neuroscience question, like how does vision work, or how does hearing work, or isolating the different sensory systems, or you get into some pretty crazy stuff. Like it's fascinating, right? That this lump of flesh can do all these wild things and generate these amazing experiences in animals in general, right? Not to just take it to the human level. Yeah, so I mean, let's see, where am I going with this? I mean, so step one, right? Safety. And then step two, just try to have a question that's just very grounded. I mean, we just want to do like concrete stuff. We don't want to jump ahead too far. You know what I mean? Uh, I mean, we're interested like Rick Strassman and these less mundane questions that it's because it's kind of hard not to be when you're talking psychedelics, especially DMT, since it is endogenous. But and you take a big bolus of it, and you have these wild experiences. What does that say about how the brain works to generate consciousness? And but you just you can't jump too far ahead, right? Because we have no idea how consciousness really works. So it's we try to stay grounded in the types of questions that we're asking. So for like our DMT study, we just want to ask some fundamental questions about how vision works, and how the body, well, how the brain produces vision, and how a visual perception differs from something like imagination. So things like that. So these questions that you can actually kind of get at the grounded, like materialist root of the question. And that's like a springboard to ask some wilder, some crazier questions. And for things like endogenous DMT, there's ways that you can ask those wild questions too. So like if there's a way to measure DMT in particularly in a human brain or in the body non-invasively, and get a good read on it, so that you can reliably say like concentrations were at this before some intervention and concentrations were at this after some intervention. If you had a decent temporal resolution, you could start to do simple things like track it across the sleep-wake cycle. And this is something even in rodents that can be done right now, with the right funding and the right study. So if you want to ask the question, is DMT potentially involved in dreaming? Which is an interesting question, seeing as we do know that it's very similar to melatonin, which is kind of involved in the sleep-wake cycle. It precursors tryptophan, so like all that funnels into like pineal regulation of melatonin and circadian rhythms and whatnot, serotonin even. So you could just track DMT across the sleep-wake cycle in rodents or in humans. Particularly in humans, it would be interesting if you were able to, correlate different aspects of someone's dreaming and REM sleep with DMT release. So things like that. I mean, most of neuroscience, I think, is like pretty correlational, at least with fMRI, like in the brain. You're just saying how do these voxels and how does this blood flow, or EEG, like how do these frequencies correlate with behaviors? So, but it's a start. I mean, it's kind of the best that we can do right now, and I think things are getting a little more sophisticated with some of the rock star like computational neuroscientists out there that are able to develop these pretty wild models of like vision, things like that. It's a pretty exciting time to be doing neuroscience, let alone psychedelic neuroscience. So safety, being grounded, being concrete. Personally, I got out of animal research, rodent research, to try to make more of a direct impact and in people's lives if possible. Only here for so long. So if we can do some studies that can be incredibly beneficial to somebody that maybe doesn't have a lot of options, like in our phantom limb pain study, it's an exciting burden of to take that on and to make sure that we pull it off in all the ways that I just described. So, and then too, being respectful of the historical roots of the medicines that we're utilizing and hopefully integrating into Western culture in the clinic. So that's something that I myself have very little knowledge of, and am trying to work at when I can and be conscious of that. We at our newly launched, soon to be launched psychedelic center, we at UCSD, we really hope we have like a whole a director for like anthropology that is leading up that charge of respecting indigenous cultures, and not just saying that, like actually trying to work with organizations like Shakruna. There is one that has contacted us that we hope to keep trying to form some collaborations with, and so it's a lot of different angles.
Yeah,
lots ins, lots outs.
A lot of what have yous.
Right.
I want to read out what I have gleaned are the three primary kind of takeaways from your 2019 study. And I think universally among the people that were interviewed in a documentary that I was watching a couple of days ago about DMT were remarking about that study being a landmark study or a landmark paper. And I want to read out what I believe those three takeaways are, and put these three to you and have you edit or add anything that you think might be relevant. This is a 2019 paper from the University of Michigan, which found one, that DMT's level in humans is comparable to serotonin and dopamine. Two, the two enzymes that are responsible for DMT synthesis occur in the same nerve cell. And three, cardiac arrest was induced in rodents in the study, which led to a 600% increase in DMT in the visual cortex of the brain. And the question there being, could this explain the near-death experiences that many people report? And I believe you mentioned that somewhere upwards of 20% of people who have cardiac arrest report a near-death experience. I don't know if that's a reasonable summary to you of that paper, but I'd love to get any additional thoughts or clarifications you might want to give on what that paper really showed.
Sure. So let me try to go 1 through 3. So the first one, so we didn't actually measure DMT in humans in the study. We measured enzymatic expression. The mRNA, so like it goes from the mRNA to the protein. And so we did see pretty high expression for the first time in human tissues, human brain tissues, and the frontal cortex, I think, in human brain we found, and in the pineal gland also, of the enzyme that takes tryptamine to dimethyltryptamine. And okay, so that was one. And then two, I think you said the co-localization. So there's two enzymes. And one of them is an enzyme that takes tryptophan into tryptamine. It's like a decarboxylase enzyme, and it's AADC for short. And that enzyme has been known to be present in brain tissue for a long time. And then the other one, INMT, is the one that we saw in the human brain tissue. So in the rats, in the rat tissue, this is all post-mortem. So by the way, so there are tissue samples that have been preserved after death, and then we're able to do some molecular biology techniques to amplify the mRNA that's in the tissues. So what's cool about that approach that we took is it's called in situ hybridization. You're able to go by like a cell by cell level. So you could look within individual tissues and individual cells within those tissues. And so that's what we did. So in the humans, we were a little more limited on the samples that we had. And we also, unfortunately, didn't have the 2 probes for the human tissues. So we only looked for the INMT. And then in the rodent, this is point 2 that you were alluding to. In the rodent study, in the rodent tissues, we found in the same cells in the brain, presumably neurons. We didn't have neuronal markers, but they looked pretty neuronal in their architecture. And we saw in the same cells, we found INMT and ADC, which would increase the likelihood that cell would be able to make DMT. So that's point 2. And then 3 is the increase at cardiac arrest. Yeah. So yeah, I mean, unfortunately, like when you're doing animal research, at the end you euthanize the animals. And so we were given permission to keep monitoring and measuring throughout the death process. And we did see, following cardiac arrest for upwards of 60 minutes later, that the DMT levels increased upwards of like 11-fold, actually. So even more than what we reported, because we had a bunch of different strains of rats, and we wanted to keep it as apples to apples as possible, and look at just within one strain of rat, because we did see some differences in different strains in terms of like neurochemistry, which is a completely another thing, but interesting. But anyhow, yeah, so I mean, we don't know though, like what that means, because it's just a fold increase. So you have to like keep in mind like baseline. Just because something goes up 11-fold doesn't necessarily mean that so much if it started out low. So the nanomolar concentrations that we reported, that was kind of like novel for the study, because again, like no one thought that it was in like the same nanomolar range as serotonin. And in the dying brain, serotonin increases like big time at death, at least in rodent models, way more than DMT. But it's interesting. So like there's a couple papers from the same group that were actually like before we put out the 2019 study. So the Borgigan lab, Gmo Borgigan at UMich, where they looked at neurotransmitter changes and electrical changes in the dying brain. And we did too with the DMT study. So, but one of the take homes, I think, is that it wasn't just like everything increased, right? So like we monitored a whole slew of different neurotransmitters and neuromodulators and neurocompounds, and it wasn't just like everything, just like the cell like dumped everything out, right? So it seems like it's a crude speculation based on not a lot of data, but it seems like that it's like a regulated process dying, right? But yeah, point being with the fold increases for DMT, I mean, I think it was upwards of like, man, I have to go back and look. I think the highest we saw was maybe like around like 40, 50 nanomole or something like that. But we didn't report all that data. And, so some of the big discussions stemming from that study was if it would actually activate the receptors, right? Because there's like a functional level that a neurotransmitter, a neurocompound, or any substance would have to meet to be able to activate. There's certain assays like EC50, I think it's called, where you would basically see a reaction, whether you're like measuring like calcium changes or there's a couple different ways of doing it. And the DMT, to be functionally selective or activate the 5-HT2A receptor, I forget. I think it's something. Yeah, I haven't thought about this stuff in a while. I'm living in like human fMRI world now, but I think it's like the lowest is in the range of like 32 nanomolar or something like that. And what we reported was only like a couple nanomolar, increase. I think the highest in the study that was published was like, I don't even remember my own study, man. It's been so long, like 10 nanomolar or something like that. But so it's really not known, like, is that in a psychedelic amount, like just because it went up 600%? Because when you hear that, you're like, oh my God, 600%. That's like everybody's tripping, right? Like,
Hmm.
but no idea.
This was a point I wanted to clarify, and I believe this is right, but I would love to get your confirmation or not on this. That my understanding is that one of the things that's remarkable about the knowledge that DMT is within the human animal is that that is unlike any other known psychedelic. That psilocybin, for example, or LSD, these are exogenous, not endogenous. They're not in our systems by default. Is that correct?
Yeah, to the best of my knowledge, it is. Yes, I mean, even things like the endocannabinoid system and endogenous opioid system, which we do a little bit of human research on the endogenous opioid system at UCSD. We actually block it while people are meditating.
Hmm.
And we want to understand if the pain relief that we would see during meditation, particularly our recent study in people with chronic low back pain, if it's involving, if the meditation is engaging the opioid system, then the idea is if you administer naloxone and block the opioid system, you should be able to turn off that pain relief effect from meditation, which wasn't what we saw in the recent study, suggesting that mindfulness is engaging something else to relieve pain. Um, but yeah, in terms of DMT, there's probably, I mean, the brain's like a soup, right? So it seems like there's other, if not psychedelic molecules. Well, I mean, 5-MeO DMT has also been reported in bodily fluids. So it could be that that is also in the brain and in the body naturally. There's just no one's really doing these studies for whatever reason. It's pretty bizarre that it's not, even if it doesn't turn out to be what people think it is in terms of, oh my God, it's why we have near death experiences. Like, it's still pretty fascinating that a molecule that is such a powerful psychedelic is naturally in our bodies, and understanding why that's the case, I think, would really help us understand the brain a lot better.
Yeah. I want to go into some of you used this word sexy earlier, sexier. Some of the more
What's
interesting.
wrong with being sexy?
Some of the wilder speculations about what might be going on during these experiences. And I referenced this earlier in the conversation about a couple of lines from Rick Strassman that I wanted to read out, who arguably has more experience with scientific studies of DMT than anyone, at least in modern times in America. And I want to read a quote from him and then a comment with a partial quote in it. And this is one from him. This is Rick Strassman, quote, "The chemistry of the research subject's brain." This is in reference to the studies that he was doing at the University of New Mexico. Quote, "The chemistry of the research subject's brains, which is the organ of consciousness, was being changed by DMT in such a way that they could then receive information that we weren't able to receive normally." Then this is another comment from Rick. "If one wanted to speculate wildly, one could argue DMT neurotransmitter system, quote, mediates our sense of reality." I've heard similar comments like that. Obviously, this is, I think you would probably agree that there is a lot of speculation in these kind of comments, but I want to, maybe move us from the known scientific studies to some of the wilder speculation that I'm sure you've given a lot of thought to. I remember learning this about Darwin, that when he was developing his theory of evolution, that one of the reasons that he was so reluctant to come forward with it is that it felt like he was confessing a murder. I think that's a direct quote. And his original plan was to wait until his death to release this because it flied in the face of contemporary knowledge and understanding about the way that the world worked. And obviously, I don't think we're at a level we probably both would agree, or we're not at a level at this point to make those sorts of claims necessarily about DMT. But to put on the speculation hat for a minute, what is your potential hypotheses here about what this molecule really is or might be, and that perhaps with the studies that you're doing right now or about to do could begin to peel back a little bit and increase our knowledge about what might be going on here?
Yeah. So Rick, I think he lays it out pretty clear that he's speculating, right?
Yeah.
He says if one were to wildly speculate, and then he proceeds to be the one to wildly speculate. It's very Hunter Thompson of him. But I mean, I don't know. I mean, I think it's important to think big like that and to have some theories that are exciting, and they could potentially be dead wrong. But it inspires people to have imagination and creativity. It's like it's so lacking in science, kind of, because everybody thinks it has to be rigid and mechanical and materialistic, which I mean are sort of important qualities for science also. kind of keeps things grounded a little bit. But so we're not there yet, clearly, and we're not there yet in terms of being able to answer those questions. I think that it's an interesting hypothesis, and Rick and I have talked about this to a pretty large degree, that there could be, much like we talked about the endogenous opioid system, the endogenous cannabinoid system, there could be a system that isn't necessarily the serotonin system that is engaged by psychedelics. And a prime candidate for that system would be an endogenous DMT system, right? Because it's a molecule that has psychedelic properties that exist naturally. So if we understood more about how that compound exists in our bodies and what its physiological role is in our bodies, that's kind of step one, before asking the bigger questions. But cannabis is psychoactive, opioids are psychoactive, and no one disputes the presence of those systems in our bodies. So I don't think we should write off the potential for DMT to be involved in the response of psychedelics. Like, so say you administer, and this is an easy study too, if you had it can be done in rodents right now, if you have the funding, if you have a way to measure DMT reliably, which in rats we do, especially at the University of Michigan, where we conducted those studies. And my friend Nick Glinos, who took over a lot of that with my old PhD advisor, Dinesh Pal and Jimo Borjigan, he has some pretty exciting data that you can pull it up now, like from his thesis, where he replicated the findings that we found with DMT, with that measurement system of the probes right in the brain. And he took it to a slightly higher degree of specificity too. We just did HPLC, so high performance liquid chromatography, and it's just a analytical chemistry technique of a way that it's like bread and butter to measure a compound, like the purity of it or the concentrations of it. And then he coupled it to an additional technique that like literally looks at like a much more like particle level, so to speak. So it's like HPLC MS is what it's called. So just, it's more sensitive. And what he saw was they found very similar to what we found. Concentrations of DMT in the living rodent brain very, very similar to the couple nanomolars that we saw. And we were looking in the visual cortex, and he looked in the frontal and in the parietal cortex, and and you could pull up his thesis online. You could, find the PDF somewhere. Found DMT levels higher than dopamine in those brain areas. So having the ability to have that assay, you could do the study where you just administer psychedelics, like say you give a rat psilocybin and then measure changes in DMT. It's a scratch the surface type of way of understanding. Step one is like, do DMT levels change? Are they modulated by administration of an exogenous psychedelic? So it's not really like super mechanistic, but at least it's like you're moving the needle, and that's kind of the first step in my eyes. And similar things could be done in humans if we had a way to reliably image in a living human brain, like with PET imaging or something like that, which we are slowly chipping at here at UCSD. So that'd be kind of like the gold standard. But from Rick, and that's kind of the Strassman quote that when you said that, it made me think of our conversations about an endogenous psychedelic system, kind of like the endocannabinoid system or the endogenous opioid system. But it's even more intriguing in this case because the molecule is the same molecule that's psychedelic, whereas to my knowledge, the synthetic opioids that are administered and the endocannabinoids aren't the same as what's in the plant. You know what I mean? So rather intriguing, but I don't know. I mean, yeah, imagine, speculate, and keep it grounded. Step one is to do the really foundational stuff, but if that research doesn't take place, and then you can't push it forward anymore. So it would be very unfortunate if more groups weren't looking into why the body makes molecules that have psychedelic properties, at least in large amounts of exogenous administration. It's a very fascinating question.
For sure. I mean, we started this conversation with you talking about how, as I understand it, at least part of your interest in all of this came from, knowing someone who died young, and probably in addition to the pain, I'm sure, of losing your friend, just looking for answers as to, like a child would, trying to wonder what it means to be human, what happens after we die. And I'd be remiss if I didn't ask you, I mean, in all of your years of working in this field, and I'm sure you have conversations like this all the time, how has your work in this field, and I guess with DMT specifically, influenced your current understanding of how to answer a question like that?
I don't know. I mean, I don't think it really has all that much, but I think it's for me personally, it's made me kind of, and this is pretty common theme to other people that have had powerful psychedelic experiences, like something that comes up in the Hopkins studies, right?
Mm-hmm.
There has come up all the time is, this from the participants is this experience of, taking like a hero dose of psilocybin in the clinic was in the top 5 like most memorable experiences, comparable to the birth of a child or the death of a parent or something. And so my mother just died not too long ago, a couple months ago, and it
Yeah,
was
I'm
very
sorry.
sudden. Thanks. Yeah, it was very sudden and unexpected. She was so we thought relatively healthy. So I was there when it happened, and was able to also go into the emergency room and just be present, like at her death. And I think that my experiences with psychedelics, my personal experiences, much better prepared me to be there for that moment. And to understand that moment a little bit better. Or I guess I could say to at least understand the importance of that moment. I mean, I know that everybody that has lost somebody would say, well, that's an important moment, but I wasn't like afraid to be there, basically, is what I'm saying. You know what I mean? It was it was just something that was very natural. It was a very psychedelic experience, not quite in the classical sense of, you know, taking a psychedelic, but the effective like qualities and overtones were there. You know, so I just was kind of there meditating and trying to be as present as I could possibly be for that moment. And so that's the best I can answer your question, because that's
Mm.
kind of like, I think that's kind of like the experience that has kind of come full circle for me, you know, losing a friend at an early age and then having all these other experiences, researching the brain, et cetera, et cetera. Yeah, because we just don't know. We could do all this neuroscience and be all smart like, and you know, at the end of the day, it's a mystery, right? Um, and yeah, so it's still a mystery,
Mm.
right? Don't understand it much better, but I think maybe don't understand like the whole thing, so to speak, but just have that perspective of maybe being a little more appreciative of it all.
Mm. Do you think that in part comes from an increase for yourself in being comfortable with not knowing the answer? I will just say personally that that used to really, really bother me. And I think the older I've gotten, the more I've realized how little I know about almost anything. And part of, I think the joy of accepting that is not needing to pretend that I know more than I do and being hopefully a little bit more comfortable with the unknown. I don't know if that's, part of what has made some of these accepting moments easier for you or not.
Yeah, I'd say that definitely resonates with me for sure. I've kind of just learned yeah, to just like just laugh, right? And just like, okay, yeah, it's okay to not know, and to yeah, it's like it's just like turn the ego off a little bit, right? Turn it down,
Mm,
tune it down a little bit, and just kind of go with it, and just be in the moment, man, for
yeah.
sure.
I love that. Maybe we can close. I know we're getting close to the end of our time together, but I know you have a lot of work ahead of you, and I'm sure studies that you're excited
Today,
about. Not, hopefully not today, but
uh,
coming up here.
oh yeah, it looks like it.
Yeah, where do you think we are right now? I mean, you mentioned that the
Well,
psychedelic
I'm
study
in
is
La
being.
Jolla. Where are you at?
I'm in Austin.
Oh,
Um,
nice, sweet.
but in history, where do you think we are? In where this increasing understanding might go in time. I know a lot of universities are opening up psychedelic centers. UT Austin just opened one down the road from here. Maybe we could close on kind of your hopes for the future. What do you want to study? What's really exciting you about this field in general?
Yeah, I think that in terms of neuroscience, like one of our collaborators the other day when we were talking about the DMT study, had mentioned, you know, he's like, you're at the perfect time in neuroscience to
Mm,
be asking some of these like wild questions about how the brain works and how we could develop these computational models to understand it a little bit better and to understand how psychedelics perturb that and potentially elicit, you know, some of the health outcomes, et cetera. Um, yes, I think you know, you're always going to say that, like contemporarily, we're at the best point we know as much as we've ever known now,
yeah.
you know. But I think from a neuroscience standpoint, that's pretty true, you know. So uh, my approach, man, is always to just stay in my lane and, you know, do what I'm good at. Don't try to like oversell it. Don't don't like take too much out of it. We're just trying to do some like rock solid science, help some people out if we can, and do it all as safe as possible, and set it up so that that tradition can continue, you know, for 100 years, 200 years, whatever. and I'm sure it'll evolve into other things. But obviously, right now, the psychedelic science is a fairly hot topic. And we just want to make sure that we're doing the research in a rigorous and reproducible way so that we can figure out what's going on with it and how to maximize the payoff for everybody involved, and especially in our clinical trials. So,
yeah, for sure. I think that's a good place to stop. I really appreciate you coming on the show and giving me the time. This was fascinating to research and a great conversation. So thanks so much.
yeah, I appreciate the invite and always down to chat.
Thanks, man.
Take it easy.